Extracurricular. It's interesting how a single mundane decision can permanently change your life. In my case, it was ultimately for the better, even though I nearly lost my job. Nothing good comes easy in life, right? I probably could have found a more entertaining way to spend my Thursday evening. According to my coworkers, at least. The beginning of a new semester is one of the busiest times for a college professor. For me to even have any free time to begin with was a miracle, and I decided to use that time to handle the orientation program for our new students. The auditorium was large, but it was so packed that night that tardy students were left without a place to sit. As I stepped onto the stage and walked over to the podium, my eyes raked over the sea of faces. Silver Millennium University's newest students. I wondered which one of these faces I would soon start seeing on a regular basis. I wondered which one of them would give me the most headaches. I tapped on the microphone. 3 sharp thumps echoed through the room. A hush fell over the crowd, and over 200 pairs of eyes fixed their gazes on me. I put on a smile. Here we go. Good evening, everyone. The sound of my voice quieted down any excess chatter. It probably would have carried throughout the room, even without the mic. I want to believe that you're all settled down, or in the process of doing so. I have a few things to tell you tonight, but let me start by saying congratulations, and welcome to SMU. Thunderous applause and a series of triumphant whoops and whistles followed. I let them have their moment before signaling with my hand for them to quiet down again. Before we continue with tonight's proceedings, let me introduce myself. I am Professor Theo Sebastian. I teach history. My close friends call me Theo. Contrary to how I might appear, I'm at least a decade older than most of you, so a degree of respect is expected. Professor Sebastian is just fine. The student orientation began in earnest after that. It was nothing complicated. I simply explained how things worked at SMU. Classes, the grading system, rules and regulations, both on campus and for those who were staying in the dorms. A handful of the students listened through the entire thing, but most eventually got distracted by their friends. Not a problem, I thought, as I continued to speak. Socialization was important at that stage. After all, they'd learn all these things on their own in due time. My train of thought was interrupted as I spotted a group of boys near the middle row. They were the most rowdy group there, so it would have been difficult not to notice them. I silently marked them as a group of potential troublemakers and was about to look away when bright orange hair caught my eye. He stood out, mostly because he was the only silent one in the group. Long arms folded across his chest, long legs bent in front of him as he sat slouched in his chair. He stared straight ahead of him, at nothing in particular. A single band-aid adorned his left cheek. Despite his near-lifeless gaze, he was extraordinarily handsome. I could tell as much, even with the distance between the both of us. As if he sensed my eyes on him, he suddenly looked up. Our gazes met. I gave him a small smile, and then I looked away. Once you've taught for a number of years, you get good at noticing little things about people at a glance. At that moment, it was plain that the young man was carrying a monumental weight on his shoulders. But what, I wondered? I wouldn't find out until later. Classes began officially the following Monday. My weekend was spent finalizing the course outline for that semester. Not that I had a whole lot left to do. Sunday night, with my outfit for tomorrow ironed and hung neatly on the closed door, a tailored navy blazer paired with slim-fitting trousers, a crisp white dress shirt, and a silk burgundy tie, I headed onto my bathroom to take a shower. Afterwards, I stared at my reflection in the foggy mirror to shave. Wavy chin length, dark brown hair, slate gray eyes, and hardly a wrinkle on my tanned skin. I smirked to myself. No wonder people always assumed I was younger than 36. Without warning, I found my thoughts drifting to the orange head I'd seen in the crowd during the orientation program. I wondered briefly how old he might be. Then I chased those thoughts away, finding them odd. In truth, I thought about him a handful of times over the weekend, and I couldn't for the life of me figure out why. Perhaps something about his troubled gaze struck me. Or more likely, it had something to do with that pretty face of his. I laughed, amused at myself as I went to sleep. It had been far too long since I'd gotten some action. The next day. An 8 a.m. class on a Monday. The excited faces I'd seen on Thursday night now looked groggy and grumpy. And would you believe that sitting right in the front row was the same young man that had occupied my thoughts that previous night? As I stepped into the classroom, that head of fiery hair was the first thing that caught my eye. As I walked to the front of the class, I finally got a good look at that face. It still looked as weary as it had on Thursday, but it looked just as pretty. I could finally see the finer details. Green eyes, framed by long eyelashes. Freckled, scattered on his cheeks. He was looking down at his phone, but sensing my gaze again, he looked up at me. His eyes widened slightly in recognition. Caught staring for a second time, how embarrassing. I gave him a quick smile before turning my attention to the rest of the class. Good morning, everyone. Shake the sleep out of your eyes, will you? We've got a lot to cover already, and you're going to need to pay attention. The class proceeded like normal. It seemed like a lot of students had negative expectations for the class. Most people saw history as boring, after all, but that happened every semester. The boy, however, listened attentively the entire time. At the end of the class, he approached me as I was packing up to leave for my next class. Today's just full of surprises, isn't it? Hey, he greeted me, adjusting the strap of his backpack slung over his shoulder. Professor Sebastian, yeah? Yes, I responded, straining to my full height. I was a very tall man, but he was only a few centimeters shorter than I was. How may I help you? I purposely let my voice trail off questioningly. Logan, he said. Logan Austins. Mr. Austins, I smiled. How may I help you? He gave me a quick but visible once-over. I couldn't help but wonder what he thought of me. I just want to ask. It's okay if I, ask you questions and stuff outside of class, right? I raised an eyebrow. Of course, I am your teacher, after all. Logan scoffed. That's what they all say, he muttered with a surprising amount of bitterness. I'm really gonna bother you, you know? Takes me a while to get this stuff. I chuckled. Feel free to bother me as much as you want. I'll be happy to go over it as many times as you need. Logan gave me a slightly incredulous look. He didn't really believe me, but after a second, he shrugged. If you say so. Don't say I didn't warn you. He gave me a cheeky smile before turning and strolling out of the classroom, casually waving his hand. I watched him go, head tilted in slight curiosity. He seemed rather playful, but there had been a slight urgency to his request that I hadn't failed to notice. It was uncommon for students to approach me for help outside of class like that, especially when the semester had just started, and when they did, it was even more uncommon for them to actually follow through. Maybe he was just more studious than he looked. I shrugged. I'll soon find that out for myself, I thought. With that, I finished packing up my things and left for my next class. Following that encounter, Logan would approach me as often as he could. At first, he started by catching me just after our classes to ask questions, which I allowed him to do, provided it didn't make me run late for anything else. But eventually, he would start to find me outside of class on campus. How do I get better at memorizing dates? I read a different version of that story on this site. Which of them is right? This is so confusing. How do I make studying this stuff more entertaining? He was incessant. Frankly, I was curious. Again, I did get students like this every so often, but I couldn't help but notice a sense of urgency with him. He always seemed like he was running out of time. Time to do what, I wondered. Perhaps it was nosy of me, but one afternoon, about 3 weeks into the semester, my curiosity got the better of me. I was nothing if not inquisitive. Logan had caught me again outside of class. On Thursday evenings, I often hung around on campus. It was rather peaceful when there weren't as many people walking about, and the crisp autumn air made it all the more relaxing. I was seated on one of the benches on campus, a book in my hands, when I felt someone slide into the empty space beside me. I hardly needed to look up to know who it was, but a familiar voice confirmed my suspicion immediately after. Yo. I glanced to the side. Sure enough, Logan was seated beside me, notebook in hand. Smiling, I lowered my book and turned my attention to him. He raised his brows as if surprised. You really aren't bothered by me, are you? He asked. I said I wouldn't be. Yeah, well, most people don't actually mean that. I did. He scoffed playfully. The weather was getting colder and I noticed he was more bundled up than he usually was. He scooted closer and opened his notebook. We began going over the last assignment I'd given them. It became clear that he was having trouble understanding what I was trying to explain to him. His brows furrowed as he became visibly frustrated. The sun was going down. Logan, how about we call it a day for now? I can always go over this another time. No, he spat suddenly. I blinked in surprise, seeming to realize what he'd just done. He sighed, tensed shoulders relaxing as he brought a hand up to rub the space between his eyebrows. It was then I noticed the bags under his eyes. I'm sorry, it's just, I really need to understand this stuff now. I frowned. Why? Logan hesitated. He continued to rub, most likely a nervous habit. I need to get good grades by the end of the semester. Can't waste any more time. This is my last chance. Last chance? To do what? I pressed gently. He stared at me for a moment before sighing and shutting his notebook. He stood, shaking his head. Don't worry about it. You're right. I'll try to figure it out, he mumbled. I stood as well. It was already quite late at this point. You know, you can always shoot me a text, I offered. I made a group chat for the course so he could message me privately from there. He seemed surprised. No, I don't want to bother you when you're off work, he said. I laughed softly. I insist. If it's just a message, I can always reply when I'm free. Logan seemed to think it through for a moment before letting out a quiet laugh of his own and shaking his head. Geez, you really did mean it, didn't you? Well then, maybe I will text you. I smiled and he smiled back. We walked to my car together, but once we got there, we unfortunately had to part ways. As I drove home, I mulled over his words. His last chance, he'd said. I thought a lot about what that could mean, but with so little information to work off of it, it was pointless speculation. I put it in the back of my mind. By the time I had gotten home, Logan had already sent me a single message. Yo. Logan would text me frequently outside of class. Frequently. To his credit, his messages always had to do with the class content. Evidently, he had way more questions than he'd let on, but I couldn't help but find his eagerness amusing and a little concerning when I thought back to our conversation on the bench. I could tell Logan was pretty popular amongst the students. He was a handsome and charming young man, so that was unsurprising, but from what I could tell, he occasionally went to parties. Well, all work and no play, as they say. I also heard that he'd made himself some enemies. I knew even less about that, but I couldn't help but be concerned. I didn't learn just how concerned I should have been until one fateful afternoon. I was walking past one of the kiosks selling food to the students when I noticed a large crowd had gathered nearby. That was an immediate cause for concern. Whenever a crowd of students was gathered like that, there usually wasn't anything good in the center. Sure enough, as I got closer, it became apparent that two students were fighting. Students that noticed me quickly stepped back, the crowd parting from me as I got closer to the middle. Exchanging blows were a blonde boy and Logan. Logan froze as soon as he spotted me, distracted, and his opponent took that opportunity to land a solid punch right against his jaw. Startled, Logan stumbled. Frowning, I clamped a hand down on the blonde and gave him a firm tug back. When he looked up at me, I was able to put a name to his face. Erin Taylor. He was rather notorious. He frequently threw parties and got into fights just like this one. He was violent, but he'd never been brazen enough to fight right in the middle of the university. Fighting on campus is grounds for suspension, I said harshly. Quickly the crowd dispersed, not wanting to get involved any further. While Logan looked visibly guilty, Erin scowled at me and shrugged my hand off him. Don't touch me, he snapped. I had to take the both of you to the school authorities, I continued, and Logan's expression shifted from guilty to panicked. Fighting on campus was grounds for suspension, in certain circumstances. He looked at me with an undoubtedly pleading expression. Already a bruise was forming on his jaw where Erin had just punched him. Other staff had probably heard of the fight by now, and if I didn't take them to the school authorities, someone else, who was probably already on their way. It's my last chance, I sighed. Damn my soft heart. You, I turned to Erin, who was still glaring at me. You'd better not be caught fighting like this again. You'll be sent home at this rate. And you, I turned to Logan and held him by the arm. He flinched. You're coming with me, was all I said before pulling him along with me. I took him to the infirmary. Of course, I had unfortunately allowed myself to develop a soft spot for him. When he'd looked at me with such desperate eyes, whatever trace of strictness I boasted had crumbled away. I was disappointed, of course, but I at least wanted to give him the chance to explain himself. After he'd been treated at the infirmary, we sat at the same bench again, and he finally explained everything to me. I don't exactly have the best track record, he started, staring straight ahead of him. When I was in high school, I did a lot of stupid stuff and I got involved with a lot of stupid people. And dangerous people. Got arrested more than a few times. A delinquent then, I thought, but I'd let him continue. I don't know why I did that stuff. I was young and dumb, I guess. I thought it was fun, but then I got held back a few grades and just barely graduated high school. My parents were so disappointed in me. I think that really opened my eyes, he sighed. I shouldn't even be here. They know people, so they managed to get me into SMU, but they made it clear this is my last chance to get my life together. I can't waste it, but... He scowled, his nose wrinkling. Erin and I were kind of rivals back in high school. I embarrassed him and his crew once, back in high school. Beat the crap out of all of them, on my own. And he's hated me ever since. I don't know how he got here, but he keeps trying to get on my case and provoke me. He sighed and cradled his head in his hand. He looked tired. He succeeded today, I guess. I considered everything he'd said silently, so he was trying to get his life together, after an adolescence of fooling around. That explained his urgency. He was still young, so I knew for a fact that he would still have many chances to turn his life around in the future, but I knew how it felt to think the way he was. I put a hand on his shoulder, and he looked up at me. You mustn't let him do that, I said gently. More than likely, he's noticed what you're trying to do and wants to pull you down again. Ignore him as much as you can. Logan sighed wearily. Yeah, I know. Look, I continued, you can succeed in life with a lot more than just academics. If you really want to get good grades, I can help you. I kept my voice soft and reassuring. I said I'd be happy to help, didn't I? He smiled at me, dimples digging into his cheeks. You did. You're so weird. It's like someone took the definition of the phrase perfect and made it into a person. I blinked, surprised by such an earnest compliment. Oh, come on. I'm hardly perfect. You definitely are, he grinned, as he sat up as if invigorated by the opportunity to tease me. You're definitely the perfect teacher, that's for sure. You're so chill. I laughed, partly because of his words and partly because I'd noticed a stray leaf in Logan's hair. It was almost the same color as his red locks, so it blended in so well that it was amusing. I reached out to pick it out. I'm glad you think I'm chill, but I won't be if you get into a fight like that again. I twirled the small leaf in my fingers before pressing it onto his palm. Especially if you lose again, I teased back. Hey, I did not lose. You distracted me, he grumbled. I would have dealt with him just fine. Wouldn't have been the first time. Well, Logan, let's hope for your sake that today is the last time you fight. I stood, and he did the same, still holding onto the leaf. After that day, Logan and I fell into our usual routine. For the most part, that bench became our official place to meet after class. We'd often sit there and go over the course material together. Well, at first. Eventually, we started to talk about other things, too. He talked about his parents and told me about the things he got up to in high school. In turn, I told him about my own years in school, though they had hardly been as eventful as his. I'd been a studious boy. But as we spent more time together, we started to grow close, much closer than I had expected. I first noticed when he accidentally opened the wrong notebook when we were seated together one evening. He shut it as soon as he noticed his mistake and stuffed it back into his bag, slightly red-faced. He'd been quick, but I had noticed it laying between the pages. He seemed to have been using a small leaf as a bookmark, the very one I had picked from his hair. It had been more than a month at that point, but the leaf was still very well preserved. Ah, I thought for his sake. I pretended not to notice. As more time passed, I found myself not noticing a lot of things. His gaze lingering on me, even though he was supposed to be focusing on his studies. A dreamy, faraway look on his face when I was speaking. As tough as he was supposed to be, his crush on me was painfully obvious. To make matters worse, it wasn't exactly one-sided. I found his crush on me endearing, and I found him as a person hopelessly charming. Whenever he smiled or laughed, I couldn't help but admire him. Of course, even though the attraction was mutual, a romantic relationship between a student and his teacher would be scandalous. If I wasn't careful, I'd lose my job. He knew this too. I was sure, which was why I never said anything about it. But as we spent more time with each other, our attraction toward each other only grew. The tension between us grew palpable. I knew it would probably have been the best for us to put some distance between ourselves, and I was sure he knew that as well. But we couldn't stay away from each other, even though we knew we were treading on very dangerous ground. Even when we started to meet up at places other than the small bench, sitting together at nearby cafes for hours, all in the name of studying. Even when our texts turned to phone conversations that would last for hours, sitting together in comfortable silence even when there was nothing to talk about. Really, it was only a matter of time. The tension finally broke when I gave him a ride for the first time. He called me in the middle of the night to let me know he was stranded. His car had broken down and he had just happened to be in my neighborhood. Late as it was, there was no way to get it checked out at the moment, so I decided to give him a ride back to his place. The ride back was mostly silent, save for the classical music playing from my car speakers. He teased me about it, but seemed to enjoy it. He lived in a small apartment on his own. When we parked in front of the building, he turned to me. You want to come inside for a bit? He asked. For the first time in several years, I felt my heart skip several beats. I glanced at him, my brows raised. What? He seemed to realize then how inappropriate his offer had sounded. In the dim lighting of the car, I noticed his face gain some color. He cleared his throat. I just meant, I'm just trying to be hospitable. I don't know if you have anything to do back home. I've got some drinks inside. Wait, you're gonna be driving. Well, I got water, he laughed nervously, glancing out the window. I smiled and faced forward again. Thank you, but there's no need for that. He nodded. I expected him to leave the car, but he didn't. He lingered, and I scolded myself for how pleased that made me. I guess it sounded like I was trying to offer something else, huh? He finally spoke again. I laughed. Well, yes, that certainly would have been inappropriate, I said. I mean, considering everything else we've been doing, it'd be... Logan quickly held his tongue, but it was too late. He'd gone there. We'd been quietly ignoring the elephant in the room, but we couldn't do that anymore. We've certainly become rather familiar with each other, haven't we? I asked with a sigh. I could see Logan cringe from the corner of my eye. That's definitely one word for it, he mumbled. He was looking at me again, staring intently. Well, now that we're talking about it, what should we do? We can't keep ignoring this forever. When I didn't respond, he added, I like you a whole lot, and I'm pretty sure you like me too. I chuckled softly. Confident, aren't we? Well, you'd be right, but we can't do anything about that, even if you chose to ignore our age difference. I'm your teacher. If the school admin caught wind of our relationship, I'd risk losing my job. He frowned. But you do want to date me. I stayed silent. I knew I could just lie, but I couldn't. I did want to get into a relationship with him. I was drawn to him, both physically and emotionally. I told Logan I would think more about it and dropped him off, but I already knew in that moment that I wouldn't be able to do anything else. It wasn't up to a week after that before we officially decided to start exploring a relationship in secret. Well, we tried our best to keep it a secret, at least at first, but I didn't realize just how badly I wanted him until I actually had him. Simple dates soon turned into long visits where we'd talk for hours, telling each other stories and getting to know one another both personally and physically. I'd forgotten how much of a thrill it was to finally have access to someone I wanted, the sweetness of a new relationship. And it was because of this sweetness that we got a bit careless. Maybe I let him get into my car on campus one too many times. Maybe when we sat together on our bench, our affection for each other was just a bit too clear. Or more likely, we were just too obvious for our own good. At the end of the day, someone found out about us. And that was none other than Erin Taylor. It made sense. He'd been keeping close tabs on Logan after their fight, even as Logan did his best to stay away from him, like I told him to. It had been about a month into our relationship, and a few weeks to the end of the semester, when he threatened the both of us separately. To me, he simply sent a menacing text message letting me know that he planned on telling the school admin my secret. Logan was calling me not even 5 minutes after I got that text to tell me that Erin had showed up to his place to threaten him personally, on account of their history. How heartwarming. He wasn't even trying to blackmail us. The bratty little thing just wanted to screw the both of us over. His vindictiveness was amusing. Or well, it would have been if it wasn't threatening my job. I wanted to believe that he was just bluffing, but I couldn't take that risk. Logan and I had to find a way to keep him quiet. But in the end, that same vindictiveness was his own undoing. It seemed that he wanted more than anything was a response. He wanted to see that he'd gotten under Logan's skin, and provoke him even more. When Logan didn't give him that reaction immediately, and instead turned to me to come up with a solution, Erin got even more impatient. It had barely been 2 days since he had threatened us when he confronted the both of us, where we usually met. Do you think I'm kidding? He snapped, glaring at us with nothing but pure hatred in his eyes. Over the course of our relationship, Logan had told me more about just why Erin hated him so much. Apparently after their fight, one that Erin himself had started, Erin had become the laughingstock of the school. He had graduated high school with a bloodied and bruised ego, and he still hadn't gotten over that. Logan stepped in front of me, glaring at Erin. Give it a rest, he hissed. I don't know what the hell you're trying to do, but I need you to leave. Us. Alone. We fought a lot in high school, fine. We're both grown now. You need to get over it. I sighed and reached out, wanting to take Logan by the shoulder and pull him back. Getting in Erin's face like that would probably only provoke him even more, I thought. I was about to find out just how right I was. Erin, I stepped in front of Logan. There really isn't any need for any of this. I'm sure we can come to an agreement here, but you just need to relax. Mind your business, he suddenly snapped at me. My brow shut up in surprise. This is between me and him. I don't care about you or your relationship. He thinks he can keep running away from me like I'm a coward. I want to make sure he gets what's coming to him. Suddenly, Logan was pushing himself in front of me again. Don't talk to him like that. Erin grabbed him by the collar. I'll talk to him however I please, he growled back. Already we were attracting stares from the few people around us. I tried to wedge myself between the both of them and pull them apart, but the next thing I felt was a strong punch to my left cheek. I stumbled back, shocked, and I saw that Erin still had the offending fist raised. My cheek stung. Enraged, Logan lunged at him, meaning to tackle him, but I was quick to hold him back. Already, I could see the people approaching. A student laying his hand on a teacher was nothing to sneeze at. And the school authorities thought the exact same thing. Erin's claim of us having an inappropriate relationship fell on deaf ears, especially since he didn't have any proof. All they needed to hear were the reports from people who had clearly seen him start the altercation, and his hatred for Logan. He was out of that school before the end of the week. After that ordeal, Logan and I made sure to be more careful. Thankfully, no one gave us any trouble, though a few people probably did have their suspicions. Even with our secret relationship, Logan remained serious about keeping his grades up, and I was more than happy to help. He graduated 4 years later at the top of his class, and it was only after that we made our relationship public. We were met with some disapproval, but Logan's family was fully supportive though. That was probably because we'd already told him about us a little bit over a year into our relationship, and they were pleased to see that I was helping Logan turn his life around. We moved in together, and that was the start of the rest of our lives. Together. The end. What do you think of student-teacher relationships in a university? Let us know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force, and stay wholesome.